and gentlemen,
can I please have your attention? Can you dig it?
Greetings, dear listeners. This is Jonah Goldberg, host of the Remnant podcast, brought to you by the Dispatch and Dispatch Media. I'm back. I am not firing on all cylinders or at 100%, but I am vastly improved. For those who didn't know, I had a deviated septum surgery that, to use a clinical term, beat the crap out of me. Just left me a hot mess. And I basically spent about 6 days, felt like there was a medium-sized monkey fist clenched right between my two eyes, behind my nose, my sinuses. And every now and then, the monkey felt like counting to 5 with his fingers. It was excruciatingly uncomfortable and unpleasant. And yesterday, I got the splints out of my nose so I could breathe again. And for a little while, it felt so good to be able to actually breathe. And to have the pressure relieved. I'll spare you the gory details. That I thought I had, that I had taken some sort of wonder drug, some sort of limitless, spice, vampire blood, whatever. I was on cloud 9 running around. And I couldn't believe how good food tasted again because I had lost all sense of taste. I couldn't believe how bad downtown DC smelled. It was just an astonishing kind of thing. And then
be grateful you don't still live in Manhattan.
Yeah. And then reality kind of swept back in last night. And I realized I'm not at 100%. I'm 1,000% better than I was 24 hours ago, which I'll take. But it's still like I have, a kind of rough head cold and I'm still not sleeping great. And I still see this giant multicolored turtle following me around saying, "Find your soulmate, Homer." So I'm a little bit of a mess. And so not wanting to inflict any of that, the potential for unprofessionalism or sloth on an official guest of the Remnant, we decided instead there was really no downside to doing it with Guy. So my amanuensis from AEI, Guy Denton, is back. And we're going to do an Ask Me Anything thing. Guy, welcome back to the Remnant.
Thank you for having me. It feels good to not have a monkey fist shoved up my nose. That was a very colorful metaphor for it.
It was more of an analogy, just to be technical. If I had simply said the monkey fist in my nose, it would have been a metaphor. But by using like or as, it makes it an analogy.
Doesn't it make it a simile?
Or a simile, correct. Yes, that's fine. You guys, I know you've purged all your memory banks of your entire childhood in that other country, but do you guys have the equivalent of an SAT over there?
No. Basically, standardized testing doesn't exist. It does for certain degrees at certain schools, but for the most part, no. Getting into college there isn't even really a personal essay component to college applications or anything like that. We don't put much weight on extracurriculars. It's all just about raw high school grades.
And whether like your great-great-grandfather killed a dragon or something.
Oh, absolutely, yes. And
pulled a thorn from a troll's paw and got 3 wishes or something. So you can attest that I have not seen any of these questions beforehand. You were credited by Coopers and Librand in all of this.
As usual, yes. Went up to the White Room at AEI and talked to the senior partners of Wolfram and Hart through the conduit.
Excellent.
And it has been approved and the Shanshu prophecy's been signed away, so you have no escape.
Excellent. Let's just well, first of all, have you been to any new Kiss concerts lately?
No, not lately. Actually, as of right now, the next extravaganza I have planned isn't until the end of the year.
Wow.
End of November after Thanksgiving, beginning of December.
I don't know if you wanted to be outed publicly, so I have to be careful about this, but I did this introduction of Cliff Asness for this award at the Manhattan Institute. It was a lovely night. I think Cliff did a fantastic job in his actual remarks. And I think I was fine in my introduction. But then afterwards, was schmoozing with people, talking to people. And a somewhat prominent person that you've heard of came up to me and says, that British guy who works for you. It's like, all I want are more episodes about the Kiss stuff. And I was like, what? And it went on for a while. I was like, yeah, I'm a huge, Kiss head? I don't know what you guys call yourselves.
Kiss Army member, I guess.
Yeah, Kiss Army. Yeah. He's like, I'm a decorated soldier in the Kiss Army. Some nonsense like this. I'm not a person I would expect.
We can cut this out if I'm correct or you don't want to say. Was it Abe Greenwald?
It was not Abe Greenwald.
Okay. But he is a huge Kiss fan. I found out recently, which shocked me.
For some reason, I don't know Abe that well. Met him a few times. I sort of know him mostly from the podcast and from email and stuff. But that does kind of shock me. But he's been shocking me a lot lately. He married this beautiful.
Oh, I saw that. Yeah.
Cantor, which is just sort of like, first of all, beautiful and cantor don't normally go together. And look, all due respect to Abe Greenwald, I respect the guy enormously. You just like, hey, did you see that he married this really hot cantor? It's like not a sentence I would have normally have expected to associate with Abe Greenwald. But anyway, so he can contain multitudes. He's full of surprises. We should get him on here and just like, are you the most interesting man in neoconservatism or something? Because
bar is low, but still,
yeah,
he probably is.
All right, so I will let you know who the guy is because he wanted your contact info, and I thought I sent it to him, and we'll see what happens next.
Okay. I'm sure I'm going to be horribly disappointed when I find out who it actually was. But I have a question for you. Do you think it's more or less insane? Do you think it's more insane to go on a cruise dedicated to Kiss, as I already did, or to do what I'm going to do at the end of the year, which is go up to Baltimore, then up to New York for 3 concerts back to back, which are allegedly the final concerts ever, but nonetheless.
How many times, just out of curiosity, if they said these are the final concerts?
This tour, which is supposedly the final tour, has been going on for about 5 years. And there was one other farewell tour about 20 years ago.
I can't denigrate cruises too much. I can denigrate Kiss cruises till the cows come home. But there are people who really just love cruises, and I've been on some fun cruises, and I've been on some cruises that were work. I don't know, Baltimore to New York to see a bunch of concerts. I think that's not nearly as crazy as like going on a vessel where it's very difficult to flee if things get weird, and where you have to have mandatory meals with other Kiss fanatics. It's just that's a different order of than like, yeah, I'll see you at the concert. I'm going to go hit the diner or whatever. I mean, like, I'm all about escape valves, right? And so, like, being on a boat where there's no escape, with Kiss fanatics, it's a next level. I'm just going to put it that way.
To the substance of what is already a riveting discussion, changing the course of American politics.
Oh yeah, but hopefully I set expectations pretty low when we began. So. All right, let's why don't we start with some punditry? Do you have some punditry?
Oh, okay. Well, I was quickly, if you're okay to start here, I was going to say, first of all, I thought it was pretty hilarious that no one asked. I may have missed it or I may be misremembering. I don't believe a single listener asked about you and your condition or even put in any nice words, but numerous people asked how the dogs are doing and also how Thune is doing, if you can shed any light on that.
Nature is healing. That's the way it should be. I got lots of notes of concern from people, so I'm a little shocked. Maybe the people we got all the AMA questions from had already independently contacted me and wished me nothing but the best.
Yeah, the Venn diagram has a lot of overlap, I imagine.
And it's not like I broadcasted this too much about this, but I did miss a show because I was out of sorts. I mean, what did Starwalt say? Did he say I haven't had a chance to listen to it yet? Did he say I was actually sick or out of it or under the weather, or you just...
I believe he did.
Yeah, okay.
And I refrained from putting anything too insulting in the description, but I think I mentioned it there too.
Okay, well, dogs are fine. It's a somewhat tragic situation. Well, potentially tragic, just a frustrating situation right now. Zoe, the dingo, the Carolina dog, the white trash swamp dog, has decided that the puppy Bear from the dog park is getting way too much attention, and she's jealous of him, and Bear doesn't care and comes charging up at Zoe, and I have to hold Zoe very still and very securely lest Zoe teach Bear a terrible lesson. And it's very sad. And I wish they could be friends, but I just can't risk them an altercation until Bear gets big enough to fight back. Zoe's got a very much W.C. Fields, get away from me, kid, you're bothering me kind of vibe when it comes to puppies. Fafoon and Paddington, for listeners who don't know and care, which is a much smaller subset of listeners who don't know and don't care, were my mom's cats. They are fine. They are thriving. They are basically living in a three-floor estate in Weehawken, New Jersey, where they are visited daily by my friend Drew, and we also have people staying there frequently. So they are running the roost, and I see them quite often myself. They, of course, miss my mom, but that's to be expected. They're also cats, so they're capable of moving on more than even most other quadrupeds. But they're having a good time, and now that the weather's nice, they can go hang out on the back deck and cast really kind of snobby upper crust aspersions at the street cats that Drew feeds out back of the house. But all the animals are fine. Including my daughter, who's home from college, not particularly excited to see the dogs, but falls over herself to see Gracie, our cat. So there you go.
And the cats continue to live in a nicer cage than I do.
Oh yeah, those cats live much better lives than you do. I mean, like it's not even close.
Unquestionably, yes. Someone else asked, and I figured I'd throw this in because of several people complained, including directly to me last time, but there wasn't enough pet content. How do you feel about huskies and sighthounds? Would or have you ever had one as a pet?
I think huskies are great dogs. I think it's difficult for people who don't own them to see the full range of their personality because they kind of come across as pretty stoic, but they can actually have a pretty good sense of humor with their families. I've seen quite a few huskies up in Alaska. Although Hollywood always portrays huskies as the major sled dogs and all these like Iditarod kind of sled dog movies and all that kind of stuff, and Balto and all that. Fun fact, one of the only times my mom made an arrest when she was a mounted policewoman was when some kids were spray painting the statue of Balto in Central Park, but that's a story for another day.
She let the muggers get away unimpeded, but that's defacing the statue that couldn't stand.
Well, maybe it was also she could actually catch someone in the act of doing something on a horse, which is not always as easy as it sounds. And while it's true that huskies and those big husky-like dogs, Samoyeds and those kind of things, Malamutes, people do use them as sled dogs, but they're like the tugboats of the sled dog world. They're not super fast. They're super strong. They like to pull. They're pulling dogs. They're sort of like Bernese mountain dogs. They are great at pulling. That's what they were bred for, is like looking absolutely fabulous because they're probably the most handsome dog breed in the world. But they would pull wagons in the Alps. They wouldn't do it fast. They would just pull them. And huskies and those big boned Arctic dogs are bred to be kind of aloof, and they're the workhorses of the dog world, to put it weirdly. But the ones who do it for speed are much smaller and much more yappy and jumpy and much more muddy because they're just not bred for looks at all. In terms of sighthounds, I mean, like greyhounds and that kind of thing, I've never owned one. The only official hound I've ever owned was a basset hound, the noblest of breeds. But he was a scent hound, obviously. And the differences between scent hounds and sighthounds are pretty profound. I guess Zoe and Pippa both come closer to a sighthound insofar as they're more visually oriented than scent oriented. Pippa, because she was bred to find birds or tennis balls, apparently, in your native country, and Zoe because she's a feral creature that tracks her prey visually and then kills it mercilessly and with zero remorse. So not as much as she used to. Zoe hasn't killed anything in a few years, which I'm pretty happy about. But I'm trying to think of other sighthounds, like Afghan hounds. I assume are sighthounds. They were basically bred by guys on horseback to hunt stuff and get out ahead of the riders. So I just don't know their personalities really well. I've never really liked greyhounds, but I have friends who have greyhounds, and they've adopted them, which I think is nice because great dog racing is gross in how they've historically treated dogs. But they're just it's sort of like huskies. It's like you got to know some dogs to see what the personality and the breed is like. And I don't know enough personally to say one thing or another.
Turning to punditry and speaking of people who have lived worse lives than animals, many people, as you would expect, asked about the GOP candidates. And one question to start with is, which currently declared GOP candidate do you think is the best hope for a less Trumpy GOP, if there even is one?
Okay, so I'm going to interpret that question as if they got the nomination, would they be the most successful at de-Trumpifying the party?
I think that's right, yeah.
It's an interesting way to think about it. Currently declared. So we're talking about Asa Hutchinson, Nikki Haley, Tim Scott, and that's it, right? I mean, who?
I guess DeSantis can count, or will count after this comes out.
Yeah, I mean, so I think it's actually a tougher, more nuanced question than it might seem because, okay, so you sort of have to plot these things out. Somebody else gets the nomination. Does Trump then say, congratulations, well fought, well won. You are noble competition. I endorse you heartily. Let's all work together to win in the fall. Very unlikely. Exceedingly unlikely, right? So does the hardcore Trump faction in the party literally leave the party? I don't think all of it does, but I don't think all of it stays either. And then does the party lose simply because enough of the Trump vote stayed home? Yes, I think that's probable. I don't know if it's probable. I think that's very plausible. I also think that a party that eventually explicitly rejects Trump wins back a lot of voters it's lost and wins back a lot of voters that the Democrats have lost, but the Republicans have not yet won. So it's kind of hard to game out all of that. So one of the questions you have to ask is which candidates, even if Trump plays somewhat nice after losing, which candidate is going to do the best at co-opting enough Trumpy voters while at the same time moving in a non-Trumpy direction? I don't know that. I mean, DeSantis might just move in a Trumpy direction, right? And so, like, is he going to really de-Trumpify a party? I'm going to be clear. I would take DeSantis over Trump, and happily so, 1,000 times out of 1,000. But I don't know that he is the best vehicle for successfully de-Trumpifying the party. I think the person who personifies the least Trumpy aspects of the party, probably Tim Scott, just because he kind of wears his niceness on his sleeve. I think he's a sincere Christian. I know it's poor form to doubt people's religious faith, but I doubt Donald Trump's religious faith. And Tim Scott is extremely patriotic, but not particularly nationalistic. And the fact that he's African American will arouse in certain fever swamp types a kind of reaction that will make it easier for people to reject the broader warp and woof of Trumpism, even though I don't think Trumpism is all a bunch of racism or anything like that. There are a lot of people in the Trumpy ambit or orbit who can't help themselves in terms of refusing to condemn people who are racist. And all of that will would help detoxify, I think, the party by drawing some clear lines. I mean, this has been my thing for 8 years now, right? Is like I got in a big fight with Hugh Hewitt about this with a bunch of people. Is that the right made this monumentally grotesque and idiotic decision to have a popular front with the alt-right types, and when in fact what the right needed to do was brighten and sharpen the lines and say this is as far as you can go and no farther without being sort of shunt, as the Amish might say, among conservatives. And instead we blurred all the lines. And I think it was a disastrous decision. And because of the responses that Tim Scott might elicit, I think it would be the project of redrawing those lines would be aided. That said, I think Nikki Haley is very good at sort of, the way she handled the Confederate thing was very adept. The way she handles various factions in the party is very adept. I don't think she would be terrible. It just like the actual Trumpy stuff doesn't come naturally to her, which is both praise and criticism. It's praise because I think Nikki Haley is, I know Nikki Haley a little bit. She's fundamentally a decent person. It's also a criticism because she's fundamentally a decent person, and yet she goes and makes compromises I don't think she should make. Mike Pence, who's been showing me something of late. I've been very tough on Mike Pence over the last 1,000 years, but Mike Pence actually believes a lot of that civility stuff, and I think he's kind of shown it not only during the presidency, which made him look very beta male and it's kind of like a sap, but in the post presidency. And the tone and tenor of his presidency would just be very different than what the Trump is. Whether that's successfully, one of the reasons why I'm stumbling on this is because I'm drugged up, but another one is that you have to sort of do dynamic scoring on this, and you have to think about how people respond to the attempt to de-Trumpify the party. And like Asa Hutchinson, I think a lot of the sort of Trumpy right would eat him alive because he just doesn't know how to talk to people. I think Vivek Ramaswamy, who's apparently a very frequent guest on cable news, would be a joke at trying to do this because I don't think he's got any political instincts worth speaking of. He's got good performative instincts and all that kind of stuff. But again, I don't think he's going to go very far. But Pence knows where the bodies are buried, and he has longer relationships with a lot of people on the right that I think that if he were to successfully get the nomination, he could claim to be upholding the mantle of Trump while at the same time defenestrating a lot of the Trumpists. I'm still very skeptical he can get the nomination.
Well, in that you basically answered every other question.
Oh, did I really?
People had, because people asked about Tim Scott, people asked about Ramaswamy, and since there aren't even that many people announced, there isn't.
Yeah, I mean, let me just say something about Tim Scott. I said this in my LA Times column. It's up at the Dispatch today, and I listened to the first 10 minutes of the editor's podcast, and it was interesting. Jim Garrity basically made the exact same point I did, and which happens a lot. Jim and I and Charles Cook and I see politics very often the same way. But given that I was literally in a stupor trying to write my LA Times column on Monday, even though I said this before Jim did, I was incredibly relieved that somebody who was not in a stupor, whose opinion I respect, came out to the same position. It's like, oh, so I didn't write a stupid column.
As far as you know, Jim wasn't in the stupor.
Fair.
Could have been drugged up out of his mind.
He does host a podcast called 3 Martini Lunch or something. No, just that. Look, I don't think Tim Scott's the most talented senator. I don't think he's the most conservative senator. I don't think he's has the most brilliant mastery of policy on all these things. He's more than sufficient on all of like the checklists that I can come up with for his actual qualifications, sort of as a politician. What he is basically is just a very decent dude. And as I put it in my column was he doesn't have potential to be a serious contender for the nomination. It is not a reflection on Tim Scott's deficiencies. It's a reflection on the deficiencies of the GOP electorate in the primaries. He's too good for the primary voters right now, not the other way around. And I don't mean all the primary voters. I mean the ones who have been institutionalized, as Morgan Freeman might say, in Shawshank Redemption, who want Trumpian politics, right? And I was saying, DeSantis is too good for a large part of the Republican electorate because he actually, I have my disagreements with him on all sorts of things, but he's actually providing deliverables, right? He's actually providing policy successes and legislative successes and electoral successes, which is what politics is supposed to deliver for people who vote in primaries. And the problem is that after scaring away a lot of normals and attracting a lot of, Trumpists, I'll hold off on too many of the pejoratives, and acculturating a whole bunch of other Republicans into thinking that what Trump provides them is what you want from a president. They may not be deplorable people. I mean, a lot of the people who most fit the deplorable label or most avidly embrace the deplorable label in real life are kind of nice people. I mean, some of them aren't, but like the distribution of unnice people is pretty broad in this country. But what they want from politics is deplorable. I mean, that's the difference. Is the deplorables as a group want from politics is deplorable politics, smash mouth politics, nasty politics, performative politics, owning the libs politics, and they don't actually want decency and good character like the way Tim Scott provides it, and they don't actually want the deliverables on policy victories the way Ron DeSantis provides them. And so those are the only two. I'm sure there's a third, but the two most obvious models for acceptable politicians is uplifting good character, decent people who are uplifting and raise people's spirits and ambitions in a positive direction through moral example and exhortation, and kind of grumpy, dickish politicians who get things done. And so, and I use dickish in a entirely non-pejorative way, right? Like Dick Cheney. There you go, dickish in that sense. Fits this model. Dick Cheney was not a hugger. Love Dick Cheney, right? I've always had a soft spot for cranky politicians who are just like, let's get this done. Mitch Daniels can actually be quite funny, but, he doesn't run away from the fact that he's boring most of the time. He just gets things done, and he has this sort of common sense, well, that's a stupid idea kind of attitude towards things. Like, I don't think Tim Scott is anywhere close to the policy, guru that Mitch Daniels or Dick Cheney are. But DeSantis might be. Anyway, they're both exemplars of what people in a party primary should want from politicians, other than the obvious alliteration. And but they've convinced themselves that Trump's nonsense. What was that Klingenstein Yacht, who was the chairman of the Claremont Institute, talking about how it's the really gross stuff about Trump that is the most important and most valuable. It's the feature, not the bug. It's the definition of political manliness. I think that is the most, the limpest, most insecure, male insecure understanding of politics imaginable. But it's what a lot of people have convinced themselves makes sense. And so if those kinds of dogs aren't going to hunt with those primary voters, you really only have two options. You can finally get back on the path that we should have been on a long time ago of redrawing those bright lines, right? going back and explaining to your voter. I mean, like voter education used to be central to what parties did, is they explained to people why they should be a Democrat or why they should be a Republican. And if they had wrong ideas, they said to them, hey, you're wrong. Let me explain it to you. And instead now they say, what do you believe? Oh, you believe in that crap? Well, yeah, it's wrong, but we believe in that too, because we share your wrongness. And the party has spent 7 years forgiving, overlooking, dismissing all sorts of grotesqueries. And they've been in the business of voter maleducation. And so you can either start trying to re-educate your voters, which is hard because a lot of GOP voters are old, cranky people. Or you got to do something that invites new voters into the primaries to swamp the people who want deplorable politics from this. And this is why, I keep talking about how, if we could entice normal Republicans, because they get a massive get out the vote effort that's not seen as for one candidate or another, but it's just seen as, look, they're taking over your party. You don't want to be a Democrat, but you can't be a Republican. The way you fix this is by creating market demand for just better politicians. I'd rather get rid of the primaries entirely, but until that happens, I don't see a lot of other options. Either you've got to explain to existing voters why they're wrong, or get right voters to start voting in primaries. I don't know what curtain number C is. I guess curtain letter C, curtain number 3. Words they know come easy.
They sure know. Which is why it's a perfect time to turn to some of the more nerdishly highfalutin questions that people asked. And as you would expect, many people asked about the historical intricacies of conservatism. I thought this was an interesting one. Is conservatism better understood as a reaction against Wilsonian progressivism and the New Deal, or a reaction against the excesses of the 60s?
Interesting. So I mean, so part of the problem is, and this is part of my argument with Matt Continetti. The conservatism of the Wilsonian era was not particularly organized or ideologically coherent, right? The conservatives, such as they were, who existed, first of all, had a very libertarian streak in them. Albert J. Nock, H.L. Mencken, that crowd. But conservatism was much more literary back then. John Dos Passos and Ortega y Gasset and those kinds of people. Even Russell Kirk was, Russell Kirk comes later, but he comes out of sort of a literary tradition as much as he comes out of any sort of explicitly political tradition. And there's a reason why they were often self-described as the superfluous men, right? There were these people who very much like our Remnant, right? The idea of the Remnant comes out of that era of the superfluous men. Albert J. Nock writes a memoirs of a superfluous man, and he was playing on that term, which was out there. I don't think he coined it, but I'm open to correction on that. And which is to say, they were just simply not part of an organized ideological effort. The Republican Party in the Wilsonian era was really comprised of sort of waspish good government types, waspish political hacks, and Republican progressives, La Follette, later TR, that kind of thing. It was not an ideologically coherent conservative thing with a real clear political program. There were some conservative tendencies to it that got built on over time. And so by the time you get to the 1960s, though, a lot has happened. Conservatism's a thing, right? And it comes out of, in many ways, the superfluous men. They start organizing. The cosmic dust starts pulling together and forming little planets and moons, and during the New Deal, and it starts to get organized. So like by the late 30s, you have something that looks like a, again, fairly libertarian political opposition to the New Deal. But it's really the Cold War that takes that those seed crops and turns it into the conservatism that we understand, where you see where it was perceived that there was a symmetry of sorts, or a reflection of sorts in a totalitarianism abroad, and the logical conclusions of Wilsonian progressivism as evolved through FDR at home. And so, like, that's why Hayek's road to serfdom argument, which again was prophecy, not prediction. Prophecies are warnings; they are not necessarily predictions. Worked both as a domestic argument and a foreign policy kind of thing, because it was like there's these ominous forces rising abroad, and there are forces at home that are imitating them and are following their footsteps on our own soil, kind of thing. Some of that got excessive. We don't have to argue about the specific, things. And so the 1960s, there's a whole other kind of liberalism that has entered into the fray, which is, it's the left liberalism that the NatCons claim to dislike, that conservatives have been complaining about for a very long time. It's sort of the Rawlsian, Rousseauian kind of self-affirmation, self-direction, radicalism, tearing down all existing norms, kind of taking the using the sort of Nietzschean resentment to say, no, crime's actually good. And so I definitely think that as the conservatism we see today is much more a reaction to the 1960s than it is to the 1919 progressivism, but the arguments all build on each other. And I personally, so I've long had this position where so there's this argument about how, the Deneen crowd want to call people like me right liberals. And it's amazing how some of the outlets that cover this stuff just simply take his word for it that I'm a libertarian. It's just really kind of hilarious. I always had, I shouldn't say always, I'd come to about 15 years ago, come to the conclusion that like the pre-Trump Claremont Institution, the pre-Trump Claremont Institute view that the Constitution is the ultimate fundament of American conservatism, was wrong. I should put it this way, was not entirely right. That the constitutional stuff is, you could argue, is the keystone, right? I mean, if you want to get into metaphors, but it's not the only stone in the arch. And that in reality, there is a lack of fundamentalism to conservatism that I think is overlooked by basically two groups, conservatives and non-conservatives. Insofar as it's very difficult when you dig deep down into it to find a universal conservative dogma, because what it is, it's a portfolio of dogmas. It's a portfolio of dogmatic positions that are bound together with the cement of a conservative temperament. And you can take almost any single item in the portfolio out and come up with an exception to it, including the Constitution, which ironically was one of the reasons why I think so many Claremontsters have lost their minds, is that they have this idea. They were so obsessed, Continetti has, I think, written about this. They were so obsessed with the statesmanship of Lincoln to go outside of the Constitution to save the Republic, this sort of the heart of the Jaffa argument, that over time they just fell in love with the idea of, they kept saying Constitution, 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 except for these great exceptions to the rule, like the Civil War. And it got to the point where through a mixture of boredom and power worship and trolling, they decided that they're going to start arguing for exceptions all the time, right? That's what the Flight 93 election argument is like, it's like the Civil War. We have to sort of put aside all of these things. All these things are really important, but not, not if you know what the situation is, right? And it's this fascinating sort of Nietzschean thing of they look so long and so hard at the abyss of finding an exception to everything that they held dear that the abyss looked into them. And so, like, I've just seen these tweets in the last couple of days from all these people. America needs a American Pinochet. America needs, all these kinds of things. And it's like, and you go and you check their bio, and they're like, Publius fellows or Lincoln fellows from Claremont who are saying this stuff. It's almost novelistic. Now, I know I've wandered far afield from the initial question because the initial question was very hard to answer.
Yeah, I can't even remember what the original question was.
Wilsonian progressivism or the 1960s. Yeah.
There we go. Yeah, there we go. Well, speaking of which, when there was another interesting one along these lines. Oh, here we go. It came from a very persistent listener who apparently has tried to ask it about 5 times now, and so I felt guilty if I didn't include it this time. Why is Wilson worse than FDR, who did far, far more, in this listener's opinion, to destroy the fabric of the country?
Where to begin?
There's a great book you might want to read.
Yeah, no, I mean, pull up a chair. I will let you guys get a pass on not doing the orc screams for every single mention of the guy's name. All right, so first of all, I think Wilson and FDR as people, FDR was a better person. He was a nicer person. He was a better person. He was a more amiable person. He wasn't nearly as smart as Woodrow Wilson, but that came in handy. Well, I can't remember who the historian was, but some famous person said, FDR was a third-rate intellect, but a first-class temperament. I think there's a lot of truth to that in terms of how it worked for him for politics. It's so before my time, never mind your time. Like, I don't see how sunny and uplifting the fireside chats are and the way he talks was, but like in the argot and the fabric of society back then, his approach was reassuring, and people took a lot out of it. Wilson was a prick, and he and I've quoted this before, but there's this great scene at the beginning of David Pietrus's book on 1920, where there's a visitor to the White House and he wants some advice from Colonel House, who was like the Karl Rove of the Wilson administration, on how to like get on Wilson's good side. And House doesn't take a minute. He says, "Find a common hatred." And it's like the only way you can bond with him is finding someone is hating the same things that he hates, right? Very much like Trump in some ways. Look, I mean, you can do first of all, Wilson was indisputably more racist than FDR. Wilson, his attitude towards Abraham Lincoln, I always thought was among the most telling. The correct position for conservatives, and this other group I would call Americans, is that Lincoln's abuses of power were, getting back to this sort of Claremonster point, Lincoln's abuses of power were necessary evils, right? That the suspension of habeas corpus, shutting down of some newspapers, that kind of stuff was regrettable but necessary for the cause of saving the Union and ending slavery. Wilson's position was all that stuff was awesome. It's just a shame that he used it to end slavery. and so it's like one thing to say evil means are justified by noble ends. It's another thing to say it's a shame that you had to use evil means for noble ends, right? And so that's sort of Wilson's. There's a point that Walter McDougall makes, that Wilson was obsessed with power. He just cared about power. When he thought that the Congress was the most powerful institution in Washington, he wanted to be a member of Congress. He wanted to be Speaker of the House. When it became clear that the president he wanted to be president. I know I have in foreign policy friends who still think that like the 14 points and the League of Nations and all that kind of stuff was the bee's knees. I'm just not sold, never been sold. Maybe we'll have, Ken Pollock or somebody on here to argue about all that at some point. We got Hal Brands coming up at some point, right? Maybe he can make that case. And I want to get Robert Kagan on because he's got this book I keep meaning to start reading. But anyway, what FDR did was bigger on a massive scale in terms of creating this thing that today we would call the state. I mean, William Lichtenberg makes this point in one of his books on FDR, and he was like the dean of FDR historians. He says, prior to the Roosevelt administration, there was nothing that you would call, Americans would not talk about the state, right? Their only interaction with the government was really the post office, and that was about it. And FDR does change all that. So while I find all of that lamentable, I can't say that every part of the New Deal was bad. I can say the big parts of the New Deal didn't do what the New Deal supposedly was supposed to do. And there is an argument that FDR's personality and temperament helped hold off far worse sort of radicalism and revolution in the country. I'm not sure I believe that either, but I don't think it's an argument that you can dismiss out of hand. Meanwhile, you don't get FDR without Wilson. First of all, FDR was a Wilson retread. And virtually every single thing that at least the early New Deal did was built on the structures, institutions, and ideas of the Wilson administration. I've written about it a zillion times. Basically, the whole alphabet soup of different agencies created under the New Deal have their precursors in the Wilson administration. Plus, Wilson, at least FDR did everybody the compliment of pretending to really like the Constitution. FDR said the quiet part out. Wilson said the quiet part out loud, and said it sort of outlived its utility. He said that the Bill of Rights needed to be replaced because it was holding us back. So like everything that was bad about FDR in my mind is basically standing on Wilson's shoulders, and everything that is good about FDR was a deviation from the overlap with Wilson stuff. But yeah, I mean, it's one of these problems of how do you do, like when you say, why isn't FDR worse? FDR was more successful. He was president for life. He was more well-liked, and he was more successful in turning Americans from citizens into clients of the state, which I think is terrible. But none of those ideas were unique to FDR. They really were introduced by Wilson and the progressives of that time. And so, I'm going to be more, and I just focused, I'm much more of an intellectual history guy than a normal history guy. So I like to focus on where the bad ideas came from more than the good implementers of bad ideas, I guess is one way to put it. But I take the point. And I think it's still, Continental doesn't have a good answer for this. I don't think Jonathan Adler has a good answer for this. I'm just thinking of the people who know this stuff. I've never heard a really good explanation for why the first generation of sort of post-war American conservatives, the Buckley generation, Hayek, I'm speaking very broadly here, Kirk, all these guys, why they could have such bile and anger and animosity for the FDR years, but be almost entirely silent about Wilson. And give credit where it's due. I got on this trail largely because of the Claremont guys. They were the guys who were pointing. This is a very Claremonty, pre-Trump Claremonty kind of argument of you have to go back and look at the progressive era as a second American Revolution in terms of its reorientation of the role of the state. That all FDR is doing is building on the damage that was already done, or the foundations that were already laid in the Wilson years. And I think part of it has to do with the fact that a lot of the early NR people and a lot of the early conservatives of the proto-conservatives of the New Deal era were veterans of the Wilson era and were either crazy ass communists, like James Burnham, or they were progressives who still saw Wilson as a right-wing figure in a lot of respects, because he was, antipodal to both Teddy Roosevelt and Taft. And this is one of these things that really can screw up a look for ideological consistency when you look in the past, is that the DNA markers for a lot of these ideas are more scattered in the political population, and it's a little more difficult to sort of draw clean lines about all this stuff. But you gotta remember, like, Wilson, when he runs in 1912, is running as a pretty right-wing Democrat, and not the new nationalism, the new whatever. TR had the new nationalism, and Wilson had the new something else, and he comes out of sort of the states' rights kind of thing because of the slavery thing. He's the first Southerner from the Confederacy to get the presidency since the end of Reconstruction, and so just like the political touchstones of what makes someone a right winger or a left winger. It's sort of like libertarian types and people like me sometimes are like, you look at JD Vance signing on for this railroad bill that's basically all Democrats for it, and he's saying that makes him a real right winger. And you try to explain to people who grew up with different scorecards, and it's kind of hard to explain. You go back to the 1920s and 30s, it's just the whole place is full of all of that, where, Ron Radosh wrote this fascinating book called Prophets of the Right. And it was profiles of 4 supposedly right-wing figures, intellectual figures. And the right-wing intellectual figures are like John Dewey and like all these kind of people who, by any scorecard today, are considered, people on the profound left. And the mixture of communism and all these other things were just all these weird magnets around the compass that make it really hard to sort of explain some of this stuff.
I thought this was a fun one. If you were to design a college course on conservatism, what would the required reading be?
It's a good question. Every now and then I get in trouble about providing reading lists for people. The question is on American conservatism, I assume, right?
I should probably narrow it
Yeah,
down.
I mean, you probably have some selections from Burke anyway, just to sort of level set. Well, Matt Continetti's wonderful book, The Right, would definitely
available from all good booksellers right now. I read this book called The Tyranny of the Klitches once that seemed informative.
I wouldn't put that in there. I'm not trying to dodge this entirely, because there are a lot of good, worthwhile books on conservatism. And we can put in the show notes, this apparently like one of the pieces that sort of enticed Continetti into this terrible life he's chosen was this thing I had written 20 years ago on a conservatism 101 or something like this, basically on this question, and stuff about closing American mind and, and Kirk and blah, 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 blah. I haven't revisited that in a long time, but I guess what I would do is I would probably not assign a lot of books. I would assign a lot of essays and book chapters. And it kind of depends on what kind of course on American history, on American conservatism it was. Was it like, here's Jonah Goldberg's what it means to be a conservative course, would be very different than here's Jonah Goldberg trying to teach a class on the history of American conservatism that is sort of useful for kids of all, for people of all stripes kind of thing. So, I mean, I would have you Xeroxing lots of chapters from Peter Witonsky's 4-volume The Wisdom of Conservatism. There'd be some stuff from Keeping the Tablets. There'd be stuff from the, ISI keeps re-releasing this book, What is Conservatism, that I wrote the preface for about 10 years ago, which has a lot of great stuff in there. But like if I'm doing a survey course, there'd be stuff from people I disagree with a lot in there. And, what's his name? Sort of a Claremont adjacent guy. He recently came out with a big compendium of conservatism. I did not read it. It was just one of these collections, but thumbing through it, I was like, okay, I see, what these guys are doing. there's this time-honored effort to sort of change the canon based upon, what is it that Orwell says, that he who controls the past controls the future, and he who controls the present controls the past. There's a lot of people wanting to control the present in order to control the past, to control the future kind of thing going on. And maybe I'm just too exhausted to get deep in the weeds on how I would like to control the future on that. But there'd be a lot of soul. I'd probably assign Hayek's Fatal Conceit. I would not assign Road to Serfdom. Actually, I don't know if I would assign Fatal Conceit. I would assign a bunch of different essays. The knowledge problem thing. I would definitely take some essays from Irving Kristol, including ones that are kind of problematic for conservatives today. I don't know. I would not take the entire. Maybe I'd take the Introduction to the Conservative Mind. I would not assign that whole book. You could read it for extra credit. Robert Nisbet's exploration of fusionism was like really, really, really interesting, and not at all gung-ho for fusionism. I would assign a lot. Nisbet's Quest for Community is probably one of those books I would actually assign soup to nuts. I'd assign a lot of Nisbet. Anyway, I could go on. I mean, this is the kind of thing that's going to come into my head. So we probably should just stop that.
And that'll annoy you for the rest of the day, which is why I wanted to ask it. I figured, as usual, we could maybe end on a quick-fire round of lighter questions. Someone asked, do you have a favorite sci-fi or fantasy novel written this century?
Interesting. This century? No, I do not.
I think it better be your answer. Yeah, I couldn't even name maybe 5 novels in general that I've read that were written this century.
I mean, I read The Diamond Age on my vacation in February, and I really liked it, but I think that was written in like 97. So I wish I had more time to read more sci-fi. The person you should actually ask this question of, counterintuitively, maybe for some people, is our own Haley Bird at the Dispatch. She, a Haley Bird Wilt. She is a somewhat secret science fiction nerd.
If John Podhoretz was in the woods and no one was around to hear him, would he still interrupt someone?
How dare you, sir, insult my friend John Podhoretz that way? He listens to this podcast. Whenever I ding him for anything, I get a text like 24 to 36 hours later defending himself. So
Is that right? I'm surprised. Yeah. Well, it wasn't him who asked about who wanted to talk to me about Kiss, was it?
No.
That's disappointing. What is the closest thing you have to a favorite band?
That's a good question. I mean, I'll say it used to be probably like, in college it was probably REM. In high school it was probably the Kinks. I don't really have, I have more like, I get really into listening to somebody for a little while and then I stop, I'm a little ashamed to say there was 15 minutes where I listened to a lot of ska, mostly this band, the Pie Tasters. But I am not, as you know, a musicologist. My wife, Jessica, is far more the person to ask that kind of question of. I've been on, basically since he died, it was barely on my radar. But since John Prine died, I've been listening to a lot of John Prine. In my middle age, I started to get really into Johnny Cash, because most of the music I listen to is while writing. I don't listen to a lot of music while driving, and I don't listen to a lot of music around the house. And it's just funny. Just like a couple of weeks ago or a month ago, my wife just turned to me and said, this is one of my great disappointments in you, is that we just don't listen to very much music around here. And I was like, I'm sorry, you might like this. So this morning, I still get Fox News alerts on my phone. I get these notifications, and Fox sends me this notification saying a member of the Beatles dies at age 81. And I'm like, well, shame on you guys. You can't just tell me Paul McCartney or whoever died, and you click on it and you go to the Fox website and you know who it was. Have you seen this? You know who died?
I have not. No. Was it like a roadie or something? What was it?
Chaz Newsby, who apparently played bass for a couple shows in their early days in Liverpool or something. I mean, it's just so nakedly, let's get the eyeballs. Who cares, And they should, I'm only joking, but someone should just go kill one of the original Beatles to punish these people for that bait and switch. It serves you right.
Charlie Cook subbed for about an hour when he read that news.
He's actually one of the few people who actually knew who Chaz Newsby or whatever this guy is.
I'm sure he was. Yeah.
No one else knows what, friggin' Chaz Newsby. Newbie. I'm sorry. There's no S. Chaz Newby. I said it to my wife this morning, and my wife knows Beatles stuff, and she was like, "Who the hell's that?"
How do you like your steak?
Depending on the restaurant, because there are a lot of restaurants when you say medium rare, they hear mildly cooked on the surface and then raw in the center.
Right.
So I like if I like a char, but medium rare, but not just blood pouring out of the place. So, which I think most people understand where I'm coming from. So, but there's some restaurants now where I just say medium rare plus, which is one notch below medium, but because I don't want it gray inside at all. Right. But I want pink to red, but not mooing. And if you say medium, it seems in a lot of places in the last 10 years, medium rare has become the new rare. And rare has become tartare, uncut tartare, raw beef. But I'm very excited. I got a chef's blowtorch, which my wife just laughs at me constantly for using. But
I can't imagine why. It doesn't sound funny at all when you say that.
It scares the crap out of the dogs, I gotta tell you. And I have a very set view. I think hanger, not particularly if you can find it not grass-fed, because I think grass-fed is one of the great cons of the last 20 years. Everyone's bragging about how their beef is grass-fed. Screw that noise. That's EU beef. EU beef sucks. You want American beef that's been fed Twinkies, corn, grains, hops. I mean, all this kind of, you want fatty, good American beef. You want beef that has, when it goes to Walmart, has to ride around on a people mover scooter thing, right? And the grass stuff is way too gamey and chewy. I do not like it. I'm not saying all grass-fed beef is bad, but there's a reason why, sometimes it's just grass finished or whatever, blah, 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 blah. But anyway, I love hanger. I think it's the most underrated cut of steak out there. I'm not saying it's the best cut. It's the most underrated cut. It's getting much more expensive. I used to not talk about it, lest people would find out about it. But I have very strong views about how long it can cook. And if it does, and sometimes if you didn't get the marinade the way I like it or whatever, you don't get the char. And so I cheat because I can just bust out the blowtorch and apply char to my steak. And I will admit, I love fried pork dumplings from Chinese, but they've not yet mastered the technology to deliver those kinds of things where they don't keep cooking and steaming inside the plastic, and they lose that crisp thing. So I re-char them with my blowtorch. It's fantastic. I used to refry them very briefly in some hot sesame oil, but now I just take out the blowtorch, and it definitely gets the moisture out of there pretty quickly.
And Jess has yet to call 911 or to inform the local asylum.
No, she sees me do it and she just laughs at me. I mean, but this is the life of, she has chosen. There are many things I do that she just laughs at me. And I don't mean a hearty, I'm laughing with you kind of laugh. I mean a contemptuous.
What have I done with my life kind of laugh.
I immediately regret my decision kind of laugh. So, But yeah, there's that. So that's the kind of steak. Anything else?
Just one or two more, because why the hell not? What is a good TV show that would have benefited from ending seasons before it did? The listener referenced Buffy in his question, which I think is completely wrong and which offends me. But
I kind of agree with you, which makes me question a lot of things. I liked the ending of Buffy. I thought Buffy started kind of lame and didn't find its legs.
I agree. I think if you watch the early ones now, it's difficult.
It's like the third season is when they kind of figured out what they were doing. Well, I mean, look, I don't hate MASH as much as Rob Long and John Podhoretz do, but every time I watch it, I'm like, I wonder more and more why I liked it as much as I did at one point. But I will say every single season of MASH was worse than the season that preceded it. The characters got worse. Every character that was replaced a better character with a worse character. And every season it became more sanctimonious and more self-referential and self-involved, and more formulaic. And by the time Hot Lips became, a sympathetic character, people should have just thrown their TVs out the window. But so somewhere in there, like somewhere, around the seventh season of MASH should have gone. What was it? Heroes was sort of legendary.
Oh, good Lord. Yeah.
For, what is it? Sheldon says on Big Bang Theory, when he says how he needs closure for his TV shows, that they just continually lowered the quality of the show for so long until nobody cared how it ended.
Mercy.
Yeah. I really right now I envision Jack Butler going on a long marathon run by himself, not listening to music because he thinks listening to music while you run for miles on end is for posers, and that real men running just to the syncopated beat of their own heart. And I picture him when I say this, stopping dead in his tracks and running back to the office to protest. But I think Lost should have stopped at the first season. I think Battlestar Galactica should have stopped at the third season. I'm not saying I didn't keep watching it, but it was so good until it decided not to be. Odd Couple just got better and better. Seinfeld got better, and Seinfeld's last season probably could have gone, but they were making so much money and it was still so good, it didn't really matter. But Seinfeld's another one that built. It did not get really good until like the third or fourth season, and was almost canceled all the time.
Frasier, I think should have died a couple of years before it did.
Yeah, they seem to be petering out. I feel like there's some obvious ones. I to be honest, The Simpsons has been on so long.
Should have died 20 years ago. Are you kidding?
From my understanding, it got really bad and then got better again. And it's just been on so long that I can't, and it's been so long since I watched it, I can't really judge. I think, not to question the wisdom of the listener who asked the question, but it's easier to point to shows that started really strong, but were canceled anyway, than shows that were really good, but canceled too soon anyway. Like that went on for a long time, but should have been canceled earlier. The most, obvious one's Firefly, but one of the best examples is actually Ben Stiller's comedy show, which was hilarious. I watched it in college. It was fantastic. And it had all of these famous people went on to become really famous on it. But it was during the era where Fox broadcast, basically, if you didn't have immediate rating success, they just dumped you. And so they killed the Ben Stiller Hour or whatever it was called. And then it won an Emmy for Best Comedy Show after it was canceled. And Stiller goes up to accept it and says, "Screw you, Fox," because I just won an Emmy for this thing. There was a great show called Prophet.
Or I was going to say, yeah, I know you like that.
There was, I thought, an intriguing vampire show. There was basically a mob show with vampires that was on Fox for a little while. There was a really interesting arty show called Tribeca. The Chris Elliott show lasted more than one season, but could have gone further.
Do you ever see Get a Life, the show with Chris Elliott in it?
Yeah, that's what I'm talking about. Yeah.
Yeah.
I mean, if you don't like Chris Elliott, it is a
Good luck.
terrible, terrible TV show.
It's a form of torture. Yeah.
It really is. It's brutal. There was another show on Fox called Flying Blind, which had Tia Leone in it. That was really, really well done. Really different. And I just think they didn't give some of those shows the time that they deserved. I like this show on NBC called Black Donnellys. That was sort of an Irish mob TV show. They only gave that one season. And there was this thing on HBO. I think it was HBO that was just canceled last year, Raised by Wolves. That
got canceled.
It went 3 seasons, but like that thing was like, imagine just waking up being a contestant on a Japanese game show while tripping hard on acid. That show was weirder than that. And I cannot say whether I think it was in fact good. Because it was so weird and so gross and so discomforting. But I wanted to see where the hell they were going with that thing. And it really bums me out that they canceled it. Have you watched Mrs. Davis?
No, I haven't.
Because my wife went traveling after we watched like the first 3 episodes. It's on Peacock. I will say that the first episode is one of the most brilliant, surprising, interesting, fun, self-confident pilot episodes of any TV show I've ever seen in my life. I loved it. I didn't love the subsequent episodes as much as I loved the first one, but I still like the subsequent episodes. Highly recommend it for people. If you don't like the first one, there's no reason to keep watching. But like, if you like the first one, there's still reason to keep watching, even if it's still trying to find its sea legs. But anyway, and I'm not taking anything away from it because it's in the show description. It's about a nun that fights an artificial intelligence.
Well, on that note, I think we've gone far enough with this scintillating, world-altering conversation.
This far, but no farther, as Jean-Luc Picard might say.
He would have pulled the plug before it even began. Probably would have gone back in time to prevent this from taking place.
There are 4 lights. All right. So I want to apologize to everybody for the self-indulgence of all of this. But you can look forward to another self-indulgent solo podcast later this week.
I was going to say, if you like today, you'll love tomorrow.
And thanks again to Chris Starwalt and David Drucker. David Drucker was the guest, right?
Yes.
Yeah. I still haven't listened to it. I mean, literally, I feel like I was in a coma last week. I mean, I hadn't read anything for more than 2 paragraphs. And I don't sound like it, but I am so much better than I was yesterday. I mean, I literally said to my wife the night before last, if you told me I can get away with it without incurring lasting physical medical damage, but I needed to pay you $10,000 to be allowed to blow my nose, I would happily pay it. I was in such terrible shape. I mean, it was just like I don't know why the monkey had to wear its high school ring. It was so bad. But thank you to everybody who I'm going to assume was thinking nice thoughts about me, even though apparently they never bothered to mention their concern in their emails. And I know Heidi, our friend Heidi, sent a lot of questions. I doubt we got to all of them. But I did forward. I don't like to look at the questions beforehand because I don't know what guy is going to pick. But I will look to see if there are any other questions, or I'll discuss with Guy, and maybe I'll deal with some of them on the solo thing. And if you can become a subscriber to the Dispatch, that would be super terrific, awesome. We would really appreciate it, and we think you would too. So with that, I'll see you next time.
No, you won't. This is a podcast.
Whatever.